everyone. Thank you very much for joining me here today. This is Paul Taubman with 9.connects. I know that our introduction there showed my colleague, but he's not the one presenting today. I will be doing that. But we'll certainly have our good friend Eric do webinars in the future. You're in the right place if you are here for our part choices webinar. And so let's get started. Some housekeeping notes first and foremost. I think we're going to have some time for questions. Not too much, but believe it or not, there's quite a bit to talk about on this subject. And secondly, we will be monitoring the questions, so feel free to ask. If you do ask a question, be specific in the questions, because if we have to follow up, obviously you're trying to pay attention to the webinar, and at the same time you're trying to answer our follow-up questions. So if you can be specific the first time, that would be great. Of course, if we have enough information, we will create a Q&A sheet. With that being said, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. My objectives. I need to define a parameter, and I know we've done it in other webinars, but in order for us to really see the full effect of part choices, we've got to start from that basic definition. From there, we need to talk about the purposes of the parameter, because again, this is going to play a huge role in the whole idea of using part choices. Then we're going to talk about part choices and see what it brings to the table based on the definition and the purposes. We'll talk about its impact on the parameters, depending on the library type that you're using, and the impact on the bill of materials. It certainly has a big one on that, depending on how you address your bill of materials. And of course, I'll talk about a few limitations that you should know about if you're going to go the route of part choices. Before we do anything, I have two really important questions I need to ask you. The first one is, I'd like to know if you've been using part choices prior to this webinar. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. We'll close it up. Hopefully you can see it here on your screen. I'm actually a little bit surprised. I thought it'd be a little bit more of a peanut butter spread. And oddly enough, the D surprises me the most, because when I first came up with the polling questions, my colleague Christopher Che basically said, well, maybe they don't even know what it is. And I said, okay, we could throw it in there. But I didn't realize that a good portion of you don't know what it is. So great. You'll definitely get a feel for it by the time we're done with this webinar. So I'm glad I'm talking to a crowd that hasn't really played with this yet. And for those who have played with it, I hope that you get a gem or two out of what I'm going to talk about here today. I do have another important question to ask you right now. What library method are you using? So we're going to open up that poll. This one is very important for me because depending on the one that you're using, you'll find part choices to be of value in certain ways. Okay, so we just closed that poll over there. So a lot of you will definitely benefit from this, because a number of you are either using an Altium-based product, such as Nexus, Altium 365, Concord Pro, or you're using symbol-centric. And I suspect that the 7% of you who don't have a formal method are more than likely using what we call the symbol-centric library. For the 17% of you who are using a non-Altium database library, some of the things I'm going to say to you are going to be almost like chalk on a chalkboard to your ears. Bear with me, because part choices still has a value to you. However, you cannot directly implement what I'm going to show in the library itself. And I did confirm that with Altium last night. However, you can still make use of it in other ways. So, and some of the things I'm going to talk about, parameters here, may give you a different way of looking at a database. And you'll see where I'm going with this here in just a moment. All right, let's just dive into it. What's the definition of a parameter? Well, the definition is really name equals value. Really simple. We have a name, we give it a value. And in Altium, we don't even have to care about the format type of the value. It's like the old programming language. You used to worry whether it's an integer or real or a string or a character. You don't have to worry about that. It's just a string. Very simple. Name equals value. But there's implications to that. And so what happens when we don't have a consistent name? Well, we get something that looks like this, right? We have an example over here. So if you can imagine, we have several components. Each one of these lines here represents, when I say lines, let's talk about rows. Each one of these rows represents a component. But every one of these things over here is a different way of saying manufacturer. Even a period at the end, as far as Altium is concerned, makes it different from the one that doesn't have a period at the end. So we always want these things to line up, and the only way they're going to line up is as long as we have the exact same name for all these parameters. We don't have that in this case. Now, same thing happens when we talk about values. right? So when the values are not consistent, well, we get something like this. So what I did here was I said, well, you know what, I'm going to take a spreadsheet and I'm going to take two values. I'm going to take 10,000, I'm going to take 5 million, and I'm going to basically put them in, and then I'll sort them out. And you can see that this doesn't sort very well. So can you imagine how it would be if you had a ton of different values, all with different formatting? So if we want to have our value to be consistent, we have to have a format that's consistent. It'll always show up in the same column, but if we want to sort on it, it has to be the same format. So there are some complexities that come with this very simple definition of a parameter. Okay, let's take it to another level. What really is the purpose of a parameter? Well, there's two of them. And it's kind of odd because I think we've always known this, but it's one of those things that's so obvious, it's just not obvious. The first one is to make an intelligent part choice for the design. We're looking for a part for our design. So if we are looking at our library, we're saying, do I want to use this part? Is this the right part for it? If not, let me go find another part. And the second thing is the creation of the bill of materials. If we make our libraries properly, it will build itself. These are the two reasons for it. And Altium knows this so well that this is their whole reason that they will not give you the ability to create parameters on the layout side. Because as far as they're concerned, you're not making an intelligent part choice at that point in time in the design flow, and you're not creating a bill of materials at that point in time in the design flow. The schematic handles that. And that's why you can see those parameters, but they don't allow you to actually make modifications to them on the layout side. In fact, before, it's only been recent that they even allow you to see those parameters. In the past, they wouldn't even show it to you. The only one you could see, or it gets passed from the schematic side of the PCB side, was the comment. And now they let you see them all at least, but they're not going to let you change them. So therefore, the purpose drives the parametric need, or the parameter need. So let's dig into this a little closer, because I think one of the biggest problems we have with parameters is we drown ourselves in them. We seem to really want all this parametric information, want it all prim and proper. And of course, if you're using a database library, it has to be prim and proper, or it's just going to be very, very difficult to manage. But I have another polling question for you. And before you answer it, the question I want to ask is, what's the minimal number of library parameters are needed for the bill of materials? So don't include things like quantity, which Altium calculates. Don't include things like the designator, which they calculate. I just want to know, what library parameters do we need to make the bill of materials successful? Okay, so I'm actually impressed. If you said 2, you are correct. Okay, so there's only 2 library parameters we actually need for the bill of materials. That would be your manufacturer's name and your manufacturer's part number. Okay. Of course, you do need the quantity as well, but Altium provides this for you. Hopefully, I mean, everybody's seen this at this point. You're not going in there and counting the number of 10K ohm resistors you're using. That would just be really, really cumbersome and difficult. But the tool does a fine job of that for you. Now, in reality, we could probably get away with 3 of them. And so if someone said, well, what about the description? Yes, I would totally want the description in there. To me, the description is the holy grail of all parameters. It's not one that should be taken lightly. And as a matter of fact, if you think about it, Altium treats it as a system level parameter. It's that important as opposed to a user parameter. So in a typical part, you have to have a description, or at least Altium gives you that text automatically to say, hey, fill this in. And of course, tool-driven things like quantity and the designators also find their ways into the bill of materials as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that in the end, to make a good bill of material, there isn't much that you really need. It's just these 3 things that come from the library. Now, I do have another polling question for you. Again, library parameters only. How many do you think you need for a part to make an intelligent part decision? So we'll open up the polls again. All right. So if you said 5 parameters, you are correct. I wish it was less, but when you really boil down to it, what do you need? You need the manufacturer's name, manufacturer's part number, because it has to be real, right? In this day and age, the days of taking a resistor and saying, I want a resistor of 10K and handing it off to somebody else to figure out what that 10K was all about are over, right? we're the ones, anybody who's doing the design has that responsibility of finding an actual part now. But manufacturer's name, manufacturer's part number. The other one we want is status or availability. And this, of all the parameters, to me, is one of the most difficult ones to maintain, because manufacturer's name, manufacturer's part number, if you think about it, are pretty stable, right? They're pretty static. Now, granted, manufacturers' names do change over time due to mergers and acquisitions, but even then, if you call it, let's say, I think it was Altera got bought, for example, from recently got bought by Intel. Well, they're still probably going to call it the Altera line for quite a while, right? It just takes a while for those things to change. So even the manufacturer's name, if it does change, it's going to take a while. Or a lot of times they'll introduce a new part and they'll just obsolete the old set of parts, and they just kind of go away, right? So we don't really have to worry about the first two. But when it comes to status and availability, that one's really difficult because it's a dynamic feature. And to have a static parameter that you got to constantly maintain and keep an eye on is not an easy thing to do. Now, some of you may have some access to something like Silicon Expert, and you have all your parts available to Silicon Expert, and Silicon Expert will flag those parts that they think are going to go obsolete or end of life. But even then, you're still going to have to go back into your library and make those changes to this particular parameter. So it's not an easy one to maintain. What else do we need? We need a data sheet. To me, this is not just, it's not just data. To me, it's a certificate of existence. And so this one, if I was told that I had to be the librarian for a company and they said, well, what do you need from me? These would be the things I definitely would want. But the data sheet to me is a certificate of existence, because from there I can build the rest of the part. And of course, the last one, which is really important, is the description. It goes back to this, because if I'm going to make any type of intelligent choice or decision, I need at least the description to do it. So the way you can boil this down for these 5 parameters, so I'd say that these 4 over here, the manufacturer's name, part number, status, and data sheet, all these are what I'd call the proof of existence. You have to have this in order to really move forward with the library part. But the data sheet overlaps along with the description, component characteristics. Now I'm going to say something rather bold over here, that if we go over to our next slide here, that do we really need all the rest of this stuff that we constantly put into our databases and into our libraries? And I would challenge that to saying, if we have a data sheet and we have a description, I'm not sure we need to keep adding all this additional information in there. And that's a radical statement from even me, who's always like, no, you want everything to be set up, prim and proper. You want the data so you can make that intelligent decision. But you know what? That also comes from thinking 10, 20 years ago, where we were manually typing in everything because we couldn't just readily grab stuff off the internet. And if we did, it was a ton of copy and paste anyway. So that's where I think my thinking has been, is just I had to realize that with the parameters are out there. In fact, we duplicate them. We duplicate them like 3 times. We duplicate in the data sheet, we duplicate it in the description, we duplicate as individual pieces of information. Okay. Now, what about the value? And I didn't add the value in there, but I thought about this one. I really hemmed and hawed about it. So what is the value of the value? Well, there is some value to it, and I would encourage this key value, right? Because sometimes it's one step that you can use instead of using necessarily the description. But consider this about the value parameter. It is definitely covered by the description, right? If we do our descriptions properly, one of the first things we call out is the key value, right? If we're doing a resistor, what are we going to call out? We're going to call out its resistance. We're going to do a capacitor. We're going to call out its farads, right? And so on and so forth. So that's kind of a good description. We'll call that out anyways. And if the descriptions are formatted, you can sort it. The second part of that is, well, I just mentioned right there, it's useful for sorting if the convention is followed, which we talked about earlier here. So the value could also allow you to do some additional sorting that you may not be able to do in the description. And I would say it's primarily for display anyways, because if you think about it, when we place down a capacitor resistor, if we have the individual value, we can enable it, and then we can see what that actual value is in the schematic. So I do feel that there is a value of having the value parameter there. We don't have to lean on it as heavily as I think we normally think we have to. Now, just to kind of throw something at you, I wanted to see how long it took to do some parameters. So I did a little experiment. I asked 2 of my other colleagues, and so I have a total of 3 data points. I took a standard resistor. Okay, this is an 0603. It's a 1 meg ohm resistor. And I dug out 26 parameters that we had to fill in. And so again, 3 of us decided, well, two volunteered, and of course I needed to do it for this webinar. So there was 3 of us who filled this out, and I wanted to see how long it was going to take. All right, and so what were the results? Well, the average time to fill out the parameters was about 12.5 minutes between all 3 of us, and the time per parameter was 30 seconds. Now I should mention something else here as well. I already gave them the names. So I gave them the SCH lib that already had the names in it because I didn't want that to be all over the place. I was just strictly looking at the values. But if they had to type in the names too, this would probably be a minute per parameter. So if it's something that you're creating for the first time and you're doing it manually, there's a chance that you're going to spend 20 or 30 minutes even on something as simple as a resistor. Okay? So what did this experiment tell us? Well, kind of some stuff, and it may seem a little contradictory, but bear with me on this. Number one, I was actually surprised at how fast we did it. And that was really because there's a lot of data out there that's already available. Most of it was just copy and paste out of DigiKey. And in some cases, you just click on a little button in DigiKey and it'll put it right into your copy buffer. You don't even have to sweep over it and hit Control-C to copy it. But the other thing that was still interesting to me is that even though all the names were consistent, the values were still in different forms. So I wanted to give you some examples of the things. So all 3 of us, we didn't collude on this, right? I just handed it out to everybody, gave them their instructions, and we filled them all in. And then I thought it was kind of interesting. So this is not obviously all 26 of them. And each of us did find different suppliers and manufacturers. So there would be obvious things that would be different, but things that would be a little more consistent, obviously they weren't. So kind of an interesting data point here. And this is very frustrating for something like a database library or somebody who is trying to keep all their data prim and proper. So that was kind of the interesting thing we found about this here. Okay, so some thought-provoking questions for you is that, do we actually care about the organization of the characteristic parameters? So again, going back to the main purpose, why do we have characteristic parameters? The only reason is to make an intelligent part decision. Once we've made that intelligent part decision, we really don't need it anymore. As a matter of fact, if you're going to debug it later on, or you can give it to a test engineer, they're going to go to the data sheet anyways. So that information was really there for that moment of time for you to make an intelligent part decision. The other question is, can the description provide the key parameters? And if we organize that correctly in our libraries, it can. And then lastly, what's wrong with the data sheet being the container of the parametric characteristics? So if there's a part that I'm looking for, and as long as my data sheet has the main parametric information, and I have a data sheet attached so I can find more information about it, why am I filling in all these other little blanks for all these other for all this characteristic parametric stuff? Right, so it seems like there's a lot of effort being put into duplicating the same data that we already have access to. So that kind of brings us to this thing called part choices. And I've been working with part choices now for 3 months under 2 different scenarios, one through Concord Pro and one through a straight up library, which I'll show you here in a couple of minutes. And what I found was interesting about part choices was that it was remarkably pertinent for bill of materials, especially if you use the BOM doc. And it decouples the characteristic parameters from the bill of materials. That's what I thought was really interesting from is that when you look at the parameters, hey, you know, you've got parameters for characteristics to make an intelligent decision to select a part, but now you also have this ability to just get information from the bill of materials if you happen to use the part choices. So where can you use part choices? Okay. You can add it to the library, and you can add it in a schematic. So going back to that question I asked early on, the polling questions, if you're using a traditional symbol-centric library like an SCH lib or an integrated library, you can add the part choices straight in. If you're using Concord Pro or 8365, and I even believe the later versions of Nexus to support this, you can use the part choices and it will autofill things in for you without a problem. Very similar to what I'm going to show in the symbol-centric library here in a few minutes. If you have a database library, as I said, unfortunately, there's no way to put it in the database and then have it propagate over. However, you can use part choices in the schematic, and it's not that hard to add it in. So it's remarkably quick to do. and it will certainly help you, especially if you're going to use what's called a BOM doc. So those are the two places where you can add it in. So what is in part choices? Well, what you're going to see here in a few minutes is there's two ways to access part choices. One of them is in the properties of the component in the library, and the other one's through the supplier search panel. Now, I'll show you that other one here in a minute, but in its simplest form, what does it provide? It provides three pieces of key information. Actually, there's a fourth one here, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The first one is just a link to either Octopart or to the website that contains an introduction or general information about that particular part. The second one is a link to a data sheet, and obviously it's going to be either an online data sheet. I shouldn't say obviously. It's either going to be an online one, or Altium also has a feature called, it's not a feature, it was a company they recently bought called Siva. And it's a database. I believe they're into databases, and it looks like the Siva system might be maintaining the data sheet as well. So it depends. You'll have to look at the link that you got, and sometimes it does simply just point you over to DigiKey or to the actual company's location itself. Remember, there's a billion parts out there, so keeping this thing updated is quite a chore for Altium. And then lastly, or second to lastly, because there's one thing I do want to talk about up here, is what I call them spins, but there's the supplier part numbers. Now there's only happens to be one of them over here, but if there's multiple, you would see this. And this to me is a really great improvement, because several years ago, when they did have what they called supplier links, you would have to take that part and you would have to apply it to each company, each supplier that allowed you to do so. So you'd have to apply it to DigiKey, and then you have to apply it to Mauser, and then you would apply it to Farnell. Altium's kind of done away with that. They're saying, look, if we identify multiple companies or suppliers that sell this part, then we will list them here. And then you can see that, and I'll demonstrate that here in a few minutes. And then lastly, and this I should have put in here because this to me is one of the most important elements of it. We talked about statuses. Well, look at this, status is right there, and this is real-time data. So if I'm looking at a part and I see that there's 37,000 of these things out there, that gives me a pretty good assurance that I can at least get through prototypes. Right now, if I'm doing volume production, this may not be enough, depending on what those volumes are. But at least I know I can easily get through some of the things that I need to do on the initial stages of this here. So it looks like this part is alive and active. There's also this thing called the manufacturer search panel. And I encourage you to take a look at it, because as a matter of fact, Altium's old Content Central, if you go to it, it will point you to the manufacturer part search. And that's what this is. And this is a universal panel as far as I can see it. It's definitely in both the schematic library and in the schematic editor. And it looks a lot like what we just saw up here, but it's a little more extended. So it gives you the first three things, and actually, of course, the fourth thing, which is the stock information. But it will also allow you to extract out the parametric data, so you can just dump it in, which again goes back to the idea that if you just want to put it in there and make an intelligent part decision, you can just do that. Now, it doesn't have to be all formatted and pretty. And you can also grab the model as well. So that's what you get from this here. Now, enough with the PowerPoint slides. Let's take a little tour of things so you can see where all this stuff falls into place. So let's jump out of here. There we go. I am now in Altium Designer. This is the Altium 20. I didn't use 21 for this because at the time I was primarily using this for some projects, and I didn't want to rock the boat by making this any more difficult. I'm assuming 21 will do the exact same thing. So let me give you a little context here. The project that we're working on, or where I started to really dig into part choices, is this Mega 2560. This is a project, it's an Arduino board, and it was a project that I put forth for a class I was teaching last semester at the local community college. And basically it came from Eagle. And I said, all right, we're going to take this from Eagle, we're going to translate it, we're going to redraw the schematic, and we're going to clean up the library. And that's what we did. So we were able to extract out the library, and this is the library that you're looking at right now. And so as a part of that assignment, what they were able to do, because this is something I set up for them, is I said, okay, I took all the parameters that were already existing in Eagle, I put the prefix Eagle in front of it so that at least they had a shot at finding the part that was associated to it. They had some requirements in regards to how the name was supposed to be developed, the description, the comment could come from DigiKey, and basically when it came to parametric information, the only thing I demanded that they were consistent on was manufacturer name and manufacturer part number. And later on, also, if they had a value, they could add a value in there too, so we could display it. Those are the three things that I demanded that they put in as rock solid parameters. And as for the rest of the parameters, I also required them to put together a part choice, just because of time. And originally, that was my intent. Was just I was worried about time. So like, oh, throw in a part choice, and that should be good enough. And that's when I started looking at the value that part choices really brought in, to the point where I decided, okay, I think this is worth a webinar. So that is what you see is this typical library here. And when I say typical library, at least for this particular project, and we heavily leaned on the part choices to make this work. So how does this work in general? Well, what you can do, so if I'm going to just add another part in here, for the moment, I'm going to call it AAA, just so I can find it in the list. But it will change its name here depending on what I do with the part choice. Now, I'm also going to grab another part over here just to have a name to use in a search. So let's grab this one here. Obviously, you wouldn't do this in a real library, but for our purposes here, just to show you how this kind of comes about. So one of the options I have is that if I want to start a brand new part and I want to add the part choice in, I can do that. So here, where do we start off with? Well, I have no information, and I can click on the editor, supply links. I'll click on this here, and this is where we can add something. So at first, when you look at it, it's like, well, you're waiting for something to happen. Well, there it is. It's just waiting for you to hit add. So let's click on add here. And now you're going to see that it's going to look for something. Now, if I had already a name or a comment or a description, this would already be filled in. It doesn't, but I'll put this over here and I'll do a Control V. And as long as I have a license, a valid license, and I have a subscription, Altium's going to go out there and it's going to find the parts. And it's going to find several of them. And can you add multiple parts? The answer is yes. You can hold down your Shift key and do that. I would recommend that you closely look at those parts and make sure that the information is the same. If there's some way, some form that they're different, you want to create two separate parts. You shouldn't put the onus on the designer to have to try to figure that out when it comes to the bill of materials time, right? Because they may have picked the wrong part, and that's going to cause some problems down the road. So yeah, so here's this particular part. This is the one I'm going to select. If you don't see all this other good stuff here on the side, it's because the little I button has probably been turned off. By default, it is turned off. But if you want to see what it looks like, you just click on it, and then Altium will show you the model. It'll show you the parametric information, okay? And it'll even show you some alternates too, which is really cool. Though, again, do your homework on that. Make sure that this truly is a proper alternate and not something that's enough to throw off a footprint. What else can you do with this over here? Well, you have your data sheet, so you can pull up the data sheet. Now, it looks like there's a bunch of different data sheets. They're really the same thing. It's just that they're able to find them from different locations. And I do encourage people that even though you have a link to a data sheet, I still encourage you to download it and then link it back into the part from some directory within the company. And the reason I say that is because data sheets disappear very, very quickly when a part goes obsolete. And to me, it shouldn't do that necessarily. I know why they do, because they don't want people asking for it, and they don't want the secondary market to constantly sell these things. They just want to get them off the streets in a sense. But on the other hand, it's really important for you to have that data sheet, because how are you going to find the equivalent of it if you don't really know what the base characteristics are to begin with? So that's why I'm a big fan of always keeping a local copy of the data sheet around. Now, what can you not do here? Well, you can right-click here and you can copy the technical details, but it just puts it in the copy buffer. It doesn't actually do any type of what I'll call data dumping into the part itself. There is a way to do it, but it's not through this particular part choice. Okay. And if I right-click over here, you'll see a lot of these things have been grayed out. And so why is that? Well, we really can't place it because we're knee-deep in the schematic editor, right? Schematic library editor. We're not in the schematic editor. So in order for us to place it, we would actually have to be in the schematic editor. And the manufacturer part search panel will allow you to do that. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. The download, it requires a workspace. You'll see that you can still get to this, but again, you got to use the manufactured part search. The acquire will not work unless you're using Nexus, Concord Pro, or 8365. But the download will certainly help you with this one. But that's a benefit of using those products, is this acquire mode. They used to call it the content cart, but now it's just basically taking what's in their Content Central and pulling it directly into your library. So, but right now, that's all I've got, is that for this particular part, what I can do is at least assign it a part choice, and I can press OK. And there it is. And I can press add, and it now becomes a part of, oops, sorry, cancel here. I'm sorry, I'm going to press OK. There we go. So now I do get two hard parameters here. So I get the supplier and I get the supplier part number, and there's my part choices. So I can start off with that. But most of the time, we probably wouldn't start off this way. And there's other ways to start off. So let's go over here to the manufacturer part search, because this one is very similar to what you just saw, but it provides you a few more options when you're trying to build a new library part. So I'm again going to go over here to search, and I'm going to do a Control V to paste this in. So we'll look for the same part, and we'll hit return. So now again, we see things that are very similar to the last time, but now we have some more options. Okay, so here is our information. So again, if you don't see the actual symbols or models here, then make sure you turn on the eye. Next to it, by the way, and you may have seen this also on the part choices, is that this will bring you into the preferences. So let's take a look at the preference page that is provided. And again, this impacts both part choices and it impacts this manufacturer part search panel that we are currently looking at. What it contains is what areas of the world you would want to enable. Okay? And by default, Altium enables all of them, so it can look all over the place for things. Also, it brings up all the different currencies. You can certainly turn those off, and of course the suppliers as well, especially those that have been verified. So this checkbox here is, or check with a circle around it, is something Altium has already done for you. If you cannot change these, that's probably because you're using Nexus, Concord Pro, or 8365, and your administrator has already set those for you. And so if you have an issue with those, take it up with the administrator to see which ones they can enable or disable, or what their justification was for turning those on or off. The suggested keyword here, so when we click on the manufacturer part search, or we go into part choices through the properties, if we already have certain things filled in, then it will automatically try to do the search based on that information, as opposed to having to type it in. And then lastly, we have what's called the parameter import options. Now this part has actually been around for quite a while, and I played with it in the past because I thought it would be a really great way of bringing in information and formatting it properly. It doesn't really work that way. It's because really beyond these categories here, which everybody uses, which are the exact same, when you start getting into the characteristic information, not everybody spells it the same way or does it the same way. So one person might call it temp, another one will call it temperature, right, or temp coefficient or something of that nature. And as a result, it becomes really difficult. But the idea behind this is that here would be, if this is what the supplier is calling it, you can give it a different name when you bring it in. So just keeping in the context of this library that we created here for this Arduino board, ours would have been for manufacturer MFG, and this one over here would have been MFG-PN. So if we did actually pull in parametric data, which we didn't do, but if we did pull it in, then if there was a manufacturer, it would actually come under this parametric name, and this manufacturer partner would come under this parametric name. Okay. So it's something you can play with. I didn't find it to be fully useful because it doesn't have, I think if they had a way of mapping something, so this is me just going off being, I guess, a wishful thinker. If they had some way of saying like, look, whether you call it man, MFG, manufacturer, and any other derivative, they all equal this, then I think that would work out really well. But this over here is kind of a good start for it, but just I have not found it to be too useful to it. So that's kind of where that is. But I'm going to cancel out of this. So what else can we do here that we couldn't do with a part choice? Well, there's actually some great things if you right click here. Again, we can't place simply because we're in the library, but this panel is universal, so I could place if I was in the schematic, which is an interesting thought. because if you're trying to assemble something really quick and you don't want to deal with the library hassles, you in theory could find that part in the manufacturer part search, take it on blind faith that that part was done correctly and place it straight down and move on. It's, you know, you could possibly do that. Okay? What I don't know at this point, in thinking about this, there's a billion components on the market. I don't know how many parts Octopart recognizes. So I don't know if they've got an algorithm that says, look, as long as it's out there, we'll find it. But at the same time, I don't know about all the models. So I'm just throwing that out there that you probably could get away with a lot of the common parts. I don't know if you're starting to get into some unusual things, if you'll be able to do what I just mentioned about just placing it. Those models have to exist. Okay. What else can we do over here? Again, we're not using 8365 or Concord Pro, so therefore I'm not going to be able to use the acquire. I can add a supplier link to this. So if I click on this, for example, you'll notice that if I go over here and go into its properties, well, this one had already been added in there, so that's kind of unrealistic. But let's go here again, right click on this, and I'll add in all its parametric data to it. So I'll click here, and if I go back to this one and hit its properties, all the parametric data got thrown in there. Now, prior to what I've been doing for the last couple of months, if I saw this, I would have had a heart attack. It's all a mess. It's a disaster. What am I going to do with all this information? But again, when you really think about it, this is great information for me to just make an intelligent part choice, and it really won't have that big of an impact on my parameters unless I happen to stomp on my manufacturing part number parameter. Okay, so now, as I said, as much as I like to have this organized, maybe to compare against 2 or more of them, I'm okay with this type of data dump. And it's great because if you think about it, I did this in what, 10 seconds? How long would it take you to type this in? This would take a solid hour to me just to, you know, copy and paste that stuff in, make sure I'm following the columns correctly. So here we go. Let's go back to this and see what else we've got in here. Now, the other thing we can do is we can import this whole thing. It'll create a new part and it'll import all the data into the new part. But there's a little caveat to this. So I'm going to click on this here, and you'll see that it did create it. And if I click on it, it puts all the great information into the properties, but guess what it's missing? The model. It doesn't give you the model, which I think is kind of silly, but I think at the same time, this is Altium's incentive is saying, well, if you want the model, then you can acquire it, and you can acquire it through Concord Pro or Altium 365. So I think they did that kind of on purpose, that they'll at least get you all the parametric data, but you got to create the model for you. So just be aware of that. So is there kind of another way of handling this, and this is, and so what you can do is you can right click here and you can download. And so when you download it, you can dump it where you want to. I've already downloaded it, and it takes about a minute or two to download it anyways. It does put it into a zip file, and what I will do is let me bring up I'll bring up an Explorer here that I can show that to you. So what do you get when you download it? Well, you get a date stamp here, and then when you click into it, you're going to get a lib package, which is basically a project package so you can turn this into an integrated library. You don't really need this piece of it. What you really want is the schematic lib. So you can open it and then copy the symbol into your library, and the same thing with the PCB lib as well. So let me open one here. I'm going to push this off to the side. If I don't have one open already, let's take a look. And I do. I have one open already. So we'll take a look at this. So I took the exact same part when I was going through some preliminary webinar stuff here, and I've already got it in here. And let's take a look at its properties. And there it is. So this was everything. So by downloading it, I got everything in here. In addition to this, it also does have a link to a footprint. So it knows the model. And of course, here they use the IPC one, so they show the M, N, and L here as well. So this is another way of obtaining a part through the manufacturer part search. So a few ways you can basically handle this over here. The odd part that I find is it's almost better that you download it and work from there if you're going to start with the part. At least it gives you the model that you can clean up. Whereas if you try to start with something, it'll give you the parametric data, but then you still got to build a model anyways. That's kind of what I would say if you're just using the classic symbol-centric library. If you're using something like Concord Pro or 8365, again, you can acquire the parts, so it just basically puts it into your library structure, and you can work it from there. You don't have to download it. Now, what impact does it have on the project itself? Let's take a look at that over here. So here is the project that we had to redraw from Eagle. Everybody, including myself, literally redrew it. We did not translate it in and then clean it up. I required everyone, including myself, to redraw it over here. And that's what you see. So every one of these parts, the libraries had to be cleaned before they went on. And we basically added in our part choices, and you can see the manufacturer and the manufacturer part number, because another element of this obviously is to create the bill of materials. And the bill of materials, there's two ways to do it in Altium. There's the classic way under reports bill of materials. So let's look at that at first. So here in the bill of materials, the one thing, if you use the classic method, this is why you do have to have those two hard parameters, your manufacturer and manufacturer's part number, because by default, this classic method is not going to use the part choice. All right, and if I go over there to columns and I take a look at it down here, I'm not going to find that. So as a matter of fact, you say, well, hey, you got manufacturer one here. This is coming from a server source. I don't have a server set up. So if I click on this here, when I say server, it's usually 8365 or Conqueror Pro. There's going to be nothing in here. So I'm going to have to rely on those parameters that I had in my libraries. And so this is it. But the rest of the information's there. If I have a clean description, manufacturer, and manufacturer's part number, I can run with it. The rest of this stuff is kind of frivolous. I don't really need to know the library ref. I do need the quantity, obviously. I'm not even sure I need necessarily the footprint, right? At least for the CM or whoever's going to purchase it. They just want to make sure the part exists and the number that they have to buy. But if you do like the part choices and you want to lean heavily on them and you say, hey, look, forget about the parameters. I just want to use the part choice. You can do that too. That would be under File, New, and we use Active BOM. So this is the BOM doc, right? And we're going to bring this up. And what's cool about this is once it finds its way up here, is that all this manufacturing information just fills in itself. Now, one of them won't do it because this is embedded, but this filled it in, which is great, right? So if I wanted to lean on nothing more than the part choice, I could do this. And there it is. And by the way, they added in a feature, and I don't remember how long ago they did it. One thing that a lot of people didn't like about the BOM doc was that in the past, the only way you could get to the BOM doc or to print out a BOM bill of materials from the BOM doc was to do it through the out job file. And it looks like they have finally remedied that. So if you go here into reports, bill of materials, it's going to look like the classic view. However, guess what you got now? You have your manufacturer part, and you've got your your manufacturer and your manufacturer part number here too. So if you want to, you can still use this method here, because some people like this one. Where the active BOM gets a little more frustrating for people is because now you've got to find other part choices for things, or you've got to here now appease some of the requirements because it's looking for, hey, is this obsolete, or you don't have suppliers, or it's not ranked, or this one really forces you to reconcile the bill of materials a little more stringently, whereas the classic method, you're kind of relying on the faith of your library to be able to get that bill of materials out. But that takes me to the last part of this, and there are a couple of things that I want to forewarn you about. So part choices are generally really great, and I think hopefully you're starting to see some of the value of attaching them to your libraries, whether you're going to continue with the parameters or not. And hopefully for those who are using the databases, that you'll use them in a post method where you can say, okay, well, I can't add to the database, but once I bring the part in, I can certainly add the part choice to the part in the project. But there's three things to note about this. Number one, you've got to have a license, and there's the subscription. So if you don't have the subscription, it's not going to show up. And I happened to stumble upon that the other day. When I was in there, I could see the library, and I forgot that when you don't have a license, you still can view things. However, you can't edit things, and the part choices are all not coming up. And I'm like, what's going on here? And I realized I didn't have a license. But you have to have a license, you have to have a subscription. Number two, you have to have the internet too, because this is real-time information. So you are leaning on the system in order to get this type of information. And then the other thing too is that not everything is going to have a part choice. Now, if you're working in defense, for example, defense companies generally just don't sell to anyone. They got to know who their customers are because of ITAR regulations. So a lot of times you're not going to find, for example, one company I know is really strict about this is Glen Air. Right? A lot of companies, military companies use Glen Air. You're not really going to find their stuff Okay, now they may have a part choice for it, and a lot of times they'll say stock is 0. Well, the reason they say stock is 0 is because the suppliers aren't allowed to sell it. You got to buy it direct. Now, there is one feature that you can use in the active BOM to remedy that, because obviously the active BOM is leaning very heavily on part choices. So under add solution, you can go over here and say create manual solution. So if you're dealing with a company directly, you can create a manual solution for it, and then it will add it in here as a part of the manufacturer and the manufacturer's part number. Okay. The only thing I have not found is, unless I've completely overlooked it, I have not found this create manual solution in the libraries. So that just be aware that I think this is specific to the BOM doc itself. But those are the things to consider. So with the time I've got left over here, I'd like to ask one more question. I will put that up over here. Hopefully you found this webinar to be of some use. Let me jump back over here to our slide deck. If you don't mind, feel free to ask some questions. And while you're doing that, let me talk a moment or two about 9.connects. So you are here for a reason, right? But let's face it, one of the biggest hassles of libraries are the parameters. They are really a hassle. I don't really care for that part. It's not as much fun as drawing them, the symbols and the footprints. And the part choices, hopefully you kind of see where they can play a role. It may not completely revolutionize your library, but hopefully make it a little more efficient for you to do your library stuff, and maybe even rethink about the way you're doing some of your parameters. And that brings to the next point, right? Hopefully it brings some efficiency to the library. So what do we do here at 9.connects? There's a number of things we do, but we do training and services, and in particular, we just certainly do library services as well. I've spent a lot of time in library services as of late. So there is configuration services, so those people who are looking to just get everything together, and we do that quite often. Library prep work, so if you're trying to get your libraries into, let's say, Concord Pro or into 8365, then we can prepare those libraries, because you don't want to put garbage in, which becomes just garbage out, right? You want to make sure those libraries are ready to go. We do provide user instruction, because in the end, we can set it up, but what good is it if you're not able to take it into the future? And so if you want more information about what we do, feel free to go to 9.connects. And if you go to 9.connects, go to the tab under engineering services, and from there you'll see what's called pre-design. You can see component library, and you can see what options that we provide. So there we go. So at this point, I am going to leave this banner up here, but I'm going to go look at the questions and see if I can answer a couple of them. So there was a good question here, and I do agree with this one. So how do you communicate through parameters to someone purchasing which parameters are essential? So for instance, a 10K resistor must be 0.1% and 25 ppm Temco. So I know that they're in the data sheet, but how would they know that they are design critical? I think it's a really great question, and I probably should have spent a little more time talking about this. To me, everything you just mentioned should be in the description. And I was a little loose when I said about hey, you know what does it really matter about the characteristic data that you put into things, such as amperage or voltage, whatever the format is. However, when it comes to description, I'm actually very keen on it being very rigid for sorting purposes. But if you put the key parameters in there and that information finds its way into the bill of materials, then that should provide the information that they are looking for. I'm a big fan of the description holding the key parameters, and I probably should have made that very clear for that. So for example, let's take the resistor, because I think you hit on all the key points of the resistor. If I was going to have a description for a resistor, it would start off with res, just so that I can sort it based on component type. Then it would be the resistance. And again, I'd be very careful about how I did it for sort purposes. Then something like the tolerance, the wattage, and then the packaging, the case size. That's normally how I do that. And pardon me, there's also the ppm in there as well. But I've noticed that if you just put those kind of things into the description alone, you'll get everything you need, and they'll be able to read it. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit more. But I do agree. The description to me is really key. If you're going to be if you're going to provide a little more slack or sloppiness to the other parameters, make sure the description is rock solid. There was a question about the value being used for display. Isn't it used for mixed sim? And the answer is yes. That's the other reason why you need to bring in the value. So if you are doing SPICE primarily, then the value plays a key role in providing information to the simulation. So yes, the value also provides that as well. Yeah, someone else brought this up. I do agree with you, Tom, on this. The question was about the part choices bring you alternatives too. And you're right, I probably did not spend enough time on this, but let me jump over here to the library and just kind of see, just to explain to everybody what that is. So of course, with especially I think about 2-3 years ago, there was some issues with the supply chain and finding parts that you needed. And so a lot of people want to make sure that they had alternate parts that were assigned or associated to it. And that's what this, the part choices do kind of bring to the table here. So when you do the part choice, if I didn't make it clear, let me do that. When I click on this, I'm just picking a part here. Actually, let's do this. There is a resistor in here that we should use just so that we can, let's just take this Born's part here. So if we don't have to just have one part choice, we can have multiple part choices. So if we click on the best thing for me to do to just show this, because they show the alternates in the manufacturer part. So let's take this here. Now, yes, I could click on the edit supplier links and I can go add. And then from there, I could, based on what it took over here. So it could try to find this over here and I can see if there's some matches that can be made here. So that's one way you can certainly do that. So let's say like if I wanted this Yageo part here and it was matching everything verbatim, then I can press OK. Of course, I'd certainly want to research this a little bit more. And I could press OK, and this will add it. This will add it to the list. So you can definitely get alternate parts as a result of this, which I do agree with. You do want to have those. If you go to the manufacturer's part search, and we'll take the same one. I think I got it in my copy buffer. Do I? Let's clear this one. Yeah, I don't know how well I'll find that with that in there, but let's do this. So it didn't find as many as I expected it to, but I think if you go down further, then here's your alternate parts. There you go. So here, well, then of course it's going to find only this part, so that's why the list isn't that long. If I just put in something more like its characteristics, which you can do, by the way, you don't have to give it an exact manufacturer's name and exact manufacturer's part number. You can certainly just you can put in something like 10K, 1%, whatever else you need. You can put that in here. You can find it. But if you go to the manufacturer part search and you scroll down, you will definitely see that there's a number of other options. Now, should you blindly take them? My answer would be no. I think in fact, they don't really let you take them other than the fact that you can click on them and they're going to probably bring up, and there you go, it's going to bring up some either Octopart or it's going to bring you to the actual site itself. And so there it is. And then you can research it to make sure that this is an alternate part. So hopefully that clarifies it, Tom, but you are right. This is a really great way of getting an alternate part available, especially with supply chain issues being the way they are. I got time for one more. Let me see if I can dig one off. So there was one question here. So I watched a workshop from Altium on Monday about the component creation. And I noticed that he was not placing the manufacturer part number as a parameter. He says he does not need that. Yes, he doesn't need it if you use active BOM, you will not need it. So let's go back over here to the project itself. Here, so going back to this file, new active BOM. Actually, I already have it open. Altium will only allow you to create one active BOM per project. So it's probably open here already. Just got to find it. There it is. Okay. When you have the active BOM, this information literally fills itself out automatically based on the part choices. In fact, active BOM leans very heavily on part choices. If you don't have part choices, the active BOM is almost just, I wouldn't even bother with it. I would just go with the classic method of doing the bill of materials and reporting. That's probably what he was saying there, is that as long as you have a part choice and you use the active BOM, this stuff will fill itself in. That's probably why you said that. But in our case here, if I was going to use the classic method of creating a bill of materials, and I go to reports, bill of materials, the classic bill of materials knows nothing about the part choice, and I would have to lean heavily on this whatever parametric data I've already got in my libraries, which in this case is manufacturer and manufacturer part number. So there it is. So that's what I think we have time for. There's a lot of questions, so I will have to put together a Q&A sheet. Some of the questions you guys are probably a little more personal, so we'll address those in separate emails. But with that, I know the hour's up. Thank you so much. Hopefully I've given you something to mentally chew on, and appreciate you coming to our webinar here today. And we'll see you at our next webinar.